Okay, good morning to everybody and welcome to the Foundation Future Leaders Conference 2021. My name is Gavin Costigan. I'm the Chief Executive of the Foundation for Science and Technology. We're really delighted that you've been able to join us this morning, and I hope that it'll be a really fantastic event. We've got 4 sessions over 2 days. So whichever sessions you're coming to, I hope you have a great time, and if possible, do stay with us for all 4. We are recording these sessions, so you'll have a chance to catch up later if there's any that you can't attend. The conference is being organised by the Foundation Future Leaders, and just before we start, I wanted to tell you briefly about that scheme because we're currently advertising for the next year's cohort of Foundation Future Leaders. So each year, the Foundation for Science and Technology works with a group of around 30 early to mid-career professionals, and they're drawn roughly equally from 3 separate groups. The first group are civil servants, parliamentary servants, or the wider public sector, and that would include people from PSREs. The second are employees from universities, from national research facilities, or similar organizations, so catapult centers, research council institutes, research charities, that kind of thing. And then the third group are people from industry, and that would also include independent, not-for-profit, RTOs. So those are our 3 groups. Applications, as I said, are currently open for the Foundation Future Leader Scheme for next year. I will put the link for those applications in the chat in just a moment. And I do hope some of you will have a look at that and apply. If you have any questions about it, do give me a call. The deadline is the 29th of November, so 1 week today. So do get looking at that. So now that's the advert over, and I will hand over to Stefania, who's chairing the first session. Stefania, over to you.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Gavin. And I would like to join Gavin in welcoming you to the Foundation Future Leaders Conference 2021. My name is Mariastefania Vido, and I'm a research scientist from the UKRI Science and Technology Facilities Council, and I'm one of this year's Foundation Future Leaders. So the title of this first session is the State of the State, creating new frameworks to deliver change. The idea is to explore future challenges faced by the UK and how to tackle them. The challenges faced by this nation going forward include tackling climate change and reaching net zero, rebuilding after COVID-19, and reducing inequality. Can we achieve this with current structures? Are capitalism, GDP growth, and the system of international trade fit for purpose to deliver this? How does government need to change to deal with these 21st century challenges? And can Parliament really hold them to account? So quite a broad topic. We will have 2 speakers delivering their presentations, followed by a panel session. At the start of the panel session, I will introduce the panelists and ask them to give a brief intervention, and we'll then move on to the Q&A session. There will be plenty of opportunities for asking questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. This will allow you to ask questions and to comment on other people's questions, and also to upvote. Upvoting questions is very important because it will allow session chairs to see which questions resonate the most. And these questions will then be forwarded onto the panel. So I would like to kindly ask you to use the Q&A function and not the chat function, so all the questions will be in the same place. So we'll have fantastic speakers and panelists today. The first keynote presentation is by Dr. George Dibb. George is the head of the Center for Economic Justice at the Institute for Public Policy Research. Before joining the Institute for Public Policy Research, George was the head of Industrial Strategy and Policy Engagement at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose and UCL Public Policy. He was the secretariat of the UCL Commission on Mission-Oriented Innovation and Industrial Strategy and the UCL Green Innovation Policy Commission. George's role involved working with the UK government on implementing an industrial strategy and collaborating with the European Commission, putting missions at the heart of the €100 million R&D program Horizon Europe. So George, welcome, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Stefania, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation as well to the Foundation for Science and Technology for inviting me to speak today. Let me just share my slides so I can begin. I hope people can see that. So, as Stefania already said, I'm head of the Centre for Economic Justice at IPPR. We're a progressive think tank based in Westminster, and we've been around for 30 years. And I've been invited today to talk about the state of the state and kind of how we can create new frameworks to deliver change. It's one of the things I'm going to focus on in my talk today are the challenges of doing so in the area of science and technology. Before moving into economic policy, I actually come from a science and technology background. So I have a PhD in physics, which I did at Imperial College London, where I was working on emerging photovoltaic technologies. And after my PhD, I did a postdoc at the National Physical Laboratory. So I'm really familiar with the kind of challenges of technology and science and how and the interactions with the state. And in fact, some of the strange things of how science and policy interact around renewable energy were the inspiration for me to move into economic policy. So coming from the unusual perspective of leading a team of economists, but not being an economist myself, I'm going to try and talk to you about the state of the state, specifically around science and innovation. And I'll talk you through some of those new frameworks that I think there's an urgent need for, and talk to you about how I have found have come to those conclusions, because I think they're quite distinct from how many economists might approach the problems. So inherent within this question of kind of creating new frameworks for change, Stefania kind of set out there as well that there are core challenges that exist. And perhaps this is a topic that maybe we'll pick up in the Q&A, but I would argue that now, more than any other time through humanity's history, or at least through kind of developed economies history, we face challenges that exist outside of our economy. So they're not things that can simply be addressed by either growing the economy more or by redistributing the benefits of that economy more widely, but they're wicked challenges that exist outside of the economy, which we must shape or transform our economy to mitigate or resolve. And obviously the first and foremost of those is climate change and the urgent need to decarbonize our economy and everything that that means. But I'd also say there are other wider challenges, such as our aging society, or the kind of interlocking challenges and opportunities of new technologies, including artificial intelligence. Why are they interesting? They're, to use an economic speak, they're endogenous, they exist outside the economy. They're wicked problems, so they have no single solution. They could have technological fixes, but they're also societal, social, and behavioral. And that means that we probably require new forms of framework to understand those challenges and to resolve them. It's very rare for one of these challenges, for example, to sit entirely within the single brief of one government department. And they often might intersect with kind of political or electoral systems in a way which makes tackling them quite difficult. So I'm going to talk about a few of these new frameworks that I think we need. The first is around understanding of technologies, where they come from and how they affect the economy and the world that we live in. And I think it's worth starting with this quote from Brian Arthur. More than anything else, technology creates our world. It creates our wealth, our economy, and our very way of being. The reason I quote Brian Arthur here is that he's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, but somewhat unusually, he's one of the only economists who actually thinks about technologies and where they come from. To me, it's obvious that technologies shape the world that we live in. They shape the world that policymakers interact with. It shapes how our economies develop and the direction in which they go. But somehow most economists treat technology as something that kind of comes from a black box and just springs into existence, when actually what I would argue is that policy and the economy are central to how technologies come into existence. So I think we need a much greater understanding of how that process occurs and also how governments can intervene and can steer that process. There's a figure here from some work by the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources, and it's a very simplified diagram that tries to paint a picture of how technologies come into existence, but I think it's nonetheless a really useful one. And it takes you from the processes that a novel technology goes through on the left, through invention, development, demonstration, commercialization, market accumulation, and then diffusion and adoption, on its pathway to becoming a mature technology that's diffused through the economy. It also talks about the different ways in which that process is pushed and pulled. So there's this common understanding that the system of technology development is in tension between a technology push, i.e. the funding of basic research, which pushes out technology, it creates new technology, which goes forth into the economy. But there's also a demand pull, certain specific needs and demands within society as a whole create a pull on a technology which pulls it through to market development. The desire for quicker computers and more capable computers pulled through silicon lithography technologies for making much smaller and more powerful microchips. The need for certain types of defense technology created the internet and GPS. So the interplay between this push and pull dynamics are also really important. Why do I think this needs a new framework for understanding? I think technologies of this sort will be pretty critical to solving any of our problems that we face. So I'm thinking particularly of climate change there, and the need to decarbonize our economy will involve new forms of transportation, energy development, etc. But also we, in the UK at least, and across many developed economies, have come to what I would think of as a failed model of understanding how to intervene in this technology development process. Ever since the early 1980s, the UK has stepped away from near-market innovation and has successfully funded invention and university research. But at the detriment, that means that often we might fail to take advantage of some of the technologies which are invented in the UK, but aren't commercialized here. And I think what that means is that across every single one of these stages of technology development, we need to be thinking about how can we put in place the right public and private sector collaborations to ensure the success. So over here on the left of the scale, it's widely understood that businesses don't collectively invest sufficiently in basic scientific research. And the answer to that has been the development of UKRI, of university science, etc. But across this entire spectrum, we need to make sure that we have the right interventions in place. So I think that's one urgent need that we need to think about if we're going to solve some of these wider societal problems. And the way that I came to understand this problem was during my PhD. So I already mentioned that I was working on novel photovoltaic technologies, and this was about 10 years ago. And at the time, the government knew that it had to decarbonize the UK's energy supply, but it didn't have a clear path of how it would do so. The model of how the government itself talked about intervening in that system was that it wasn't the government's role to choose a technology, to choose, say, wind or solar or nuclear power. It was to create a framework in which the private sector can choose through the price mechanism and through cost reduction. Companies would select technologies which would go forward. Now, I think that if you look at this understanding of how technologies are developed and the way that each of these things is steered by the state, then it's quite clear that if you're going to put in place interventions to help demonstration or commercialization, they're going to be very different for a wind turbine than for a nuclear power station. And there's an inherent need there to select, to choose, and to support specific kinds of technologies to solve wider societal challenges. I think we've seen some progress on this over the past 10 years. So today, Boris Johnson has kind of announced a 10-point plan of achieving net zero, which is basically a technology-specific plan of how to intervene in the development of different low-carbon technologies. The state has come round to the idea that it has to choose. It can't simply create this transparent framework in an environment in which others do the choosing. And I think the way that you can also understand this is to look at cost reduction. So these two figures should probably be labeled. On the left, what you're looking at is the reduction in price of energy generated by offshore wind in the UK. And on the right-hand side, which is the figure I'll start with, is a much longer time scale, but shows the cost reduction of solar power over several decades since its discovery in the early 20th century. Real development from the 1950s onwards. And this comes from the work of the economist Greg Nemeth, who wrote a great book, who I definitely point people towards, called How Did Solar Power Become So Cheap? And what you can see is that over the course of 70 years, solar power has reduced in price, the cost of generating a megawatt hour here, by about 5 orders of magnitude. And there are great signs that this can go even further. Throughout the means through which that cost reduction has happened, the means through which that technology has entered the market in which people can buy and sell and interact with that has reduced, and has been through a path through cost reduction, through successive governments making strategic interventions outside of a purely market system to intervene and to support the technology development. Now, you can see that some of these will have been at the left-hand end of that scale. Bell Labs was working in the fundamental development of solar power. But right over at the right-hand side, you can see the point around 2010, which is labeled FIT, F-I-T. That's a feed-in tariff, the introduction of policies which allowed people who had solar panels on their roof to sell that power back to the national grid. The development of that feed-in tariff policy was not only a government intervention, it was also a government intervention on the demand side. It created the demand and the market for people to sell their energy back to the grid, and that created a huge demand which China and Chinese companies filled and reduced the cost of solar power incredibly. On the left-hand side, you can see an example of how this has worked in the UK over the past decade. And the UK has become a world leader in the installer of offshore wind, and the way it's done so is through a system called contracts for difference. And through successive rounds of auctions in which the government guarantees a price for offshore wind energy, the government has de-risked investment in that type of technology and has facilitated a system in which private companies are able to invest. And the result of that is that, as you can see, over the past 10 years, prices have come down from about 150, 160 pounds per megawatt hour down to about 40, 30. And again, there are signs, really promising signs, that this goes even faster. It can go even lower. So I think just to underscore, this is like the first of the main frameworks which I think we really need to move back on. Over the past 30, 40 years, we've had a failed understanding of how private and public sectors can interact and how the market can interact with technology development. And I think that understanding that and understanding how we can steer that process will be critical for solving future challenges. The second, drawing on the work of the economist Mariana Mazzucato, who I worked with over the course of 2-3 years, just before joining IPPR. And Mariana's fond of saying that innovation and economic growth don't just have a rate, but they also have a direction. And again, how did I come to the same kind of conclusion? When I was working on solar power, we were always targeting the price, or how expensive it was as a technology. And that meant that we were targeting gas, and we were always trying to get the pounds per kilowatt hour down to the same level that gas could achieve. Now, it seemed impossible to me when I was a physicist, but even less comprehensible now that I work in economics, that those two things should be considered on the same price basis. If you're trying to reach the zero carbon or future in the economy, or trying to solve climate change, it's very clear that you can't be considering a technology that emits carbon dioxide on the same basis of a technology which doesn't. And what that goes to show is that, to use economics speak, our market doesn't include negative externalities. What does that mean? It means that within the price on a product, it doesn't include sufficiently it doesn't understand or encompass how much damage that carbon emitted through the process does to the environment. And what Mariana is talking about with this kind of quote, that the economy has a rate as well as a direction. The economy can grow, but it could be growing in a clean, low carbon direction. We could be continuously shifting different processes towards low carbon alternatives. Or it could be growing in a dirty, coal emitting direction, which doesn't help in the wider environment. The work that Mariana has done at UCL and the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose is to develop a framework called mission-oriented innovation, which is if you acknowledge this idea that innovation and economic growth has a direction, what Mariana is trying to grasp is how can government and policymakers then interact with that? How can they shift the direction? How can they steer it in a specific direction towards societally desirable challenges? And and there's a diagram there which comes from some of Mariana's work, but taking a grand challenge like climate change and breaking it down into a set of very specific missions, which different people, scientists, departments, regulators will have to come together to support. It's a way of steering that innovation. And I hope Greg will come to talk about this in the speech after mine, but the document on the right there was the government's industrial strategy released in 2017 when Greg was Secretary of State. And that drew on some of Mariana's leading work and set out 4 grand challenges. And unfortunately, this policy is no longer kind of central to the government's plans, and they've rowed back on some of those grand challenge ambitions. But I think mission-oriented innovation as a framework in which you can complement the price mechanism or the market to steer the economy in specific directions and towards the solution, towards societal challenges, is incredibly powerful and will be in the future when we talk about solving any of those challenges. And the third area, which I think we need to think about in new frameworks, is how we understand productivity. Stefania, again, in her introduction, spoke about inequality as one of the main challenges that our economies face. Productivity is a kind of complicated economics term. Essentially, it's how much time and effort it takes to manufacture or create a unit in the economy. So how many man hours does it take to create a car? How much effort does it create to create an algorithm, etc. But the most important way of understanding productivity is it's the connection between the growth of our economy and people's actual lived experience, so their wages and their conditions. And productivity and increasing productivity is the way that we can ensure that we have a growing economy, but the benefits of that growing economy are shared with wider society. And drawing on a quote here from Richard Jones, who's an academic at the University of Manchester, he said, if we lived in a rational world, the collapse in productivity growth since the global financial crisis will be at the front of all political discussion because it's the origin of stagnant wage growth and sour politics. What's Richard talking about? He's talking about this, which is called the productivity puzzle. So if you look over the past 50 years of the UK labour productivity, you can see that from the 1970s right up until the late 2000s to the financial crisis, the UK productivity grew pretty consistently by about 2.3% every year. And since 2008, that something has fundamentally broken in our economy, and that productivity growth has slowed to less than 0.5%. Now, if I knew the cause of that or the solution to that puzzle, I would probably be giving a speech today at the Nobel Academy and accepting the Nobel Prize for Economics. Nobody understands the full cause of that, but something fundamentally shifted in around 2008, 2009 in our economy. What has that meant? If productivity were to carry on growing at the same rate it did pre-financial crisis, it would be about 23% higher than it is today. That means people's wages could be 23% higher, their conditions could be better. And our failure to tackle this productivity problem means that whilst our economy has continued to grow since the financial crisis and has recovered to some extent, the benefits of that haven't been shared. Somewhat remarkably, and why I think we need a new puzzle, a new framework for understanding this, the yellow lines here show every year the Office for Budgetary Responsibility's forecasts for how productivity is going to improve. And you can see that every year since 2000, well, actually every 6 months, because they release 2 a year, every 6 months since June 2010, the OBR has forecast this is going to be the year when productivity starts to recover. This is going to be the year that it starts to pick up again from that stagnant 0.5% growth per year. And again, right up until last month when Rishi Sunak made his budget, the OBR was forecasting next year, 2022, is going to be the year that productivity picks up again. And in fact, it's never happened. Productivity has remained stagnant. We have failed to see a recovery. So I think fundamentally, we need a new understanding of how productivity is affected by government policy, because it's going to be critical to remedying inequality that we see across our economy and driving towards that high wage, high condition economy that the Prime Minister has recently said that he wants to target. Now, I have a little bit about investment, but I can see that I'm running a little short on time, so I won't talk about much of that. But just to summarize that bit of my talk, I think there are really 3 urgent new frameworks that we need. We need to understand technology and how it comes into existence. We need to understand how to steer the direction of the economy, and we need to understand the drivers of productivity. Now, Greg is going to come on, I think, to speak a little bit about how Parliament and policy can help interact with some of these frameworks. But it'd be remiss of me not to talk about the one thing which I think is a critical barrier to achieving this. And that's one bit of the Whitehall machinery, which is the Treasury in the UK. So what does the Treasury do? It's the most powerful department in Whitehall, but it actually has 5 main roles. It's a budgetary ministry, i.e. it decides how much departments can spend. It's a fiscal ministry, so it sets taxes. It's the financial ministry, it manages our UK public sector debt. It's an economics ministry, so it thinks about the long-term direction of the UK economy. And it's also the kind of body in Whitehall that thinks about the UK financial services sector. And actually, the Treasury is pretty unique around the world in this. In almost every other country, these different responsibilities are divided between 2, 3, even 4 different government departments. For example, in the Treasury, the budget is set by the Office for Management and Budget. There's the Finance Ministry and the Economics Ministry. Now, the Treasury, by being set up in this way, has got some kind of long-term skews, but it's often criticised for being too concerned with expense over return and too short-termist in its thinking. And I'll wrap up quickly by saying that I think that the existence of the Treasury, its powerful position within Whitehall, and that kind of short-termist penny-pinching approach is part of the problem of why we have failed to ever capture some of these long-term benefits in the UK economy. And I would strongly argue that the Treasury should be broken up and that we need an economics ministry in the UK separate from the Treasury, which thinks about the long-term growth and direction of the economy. And actually, under Greg's leadership, BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, to some extent was empowered to try and do that, although I would say that unfortunately I think that project has probably failed. So very quickly to wrap up, in my view, to really confront the challenges that we need to see in our economy, we need to go back on a failed 50-year experiment of leaving all of these systems to the market, and we need to radically rebuild the state to steer markets towards societally desirable outcomes. Markets have failed to deliver the outcomes that we need. We can see that due to our failure to tackle climate change. And it's the role of an enabled and coordinated state to shape markets and to direct and transform the economy. And with that, I will wrap up, and I'm very keen to pick up any questions that you might have in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, George, for the very insightful talk and a very interesting economic point of view for looking at challenges and frameworks to tackle them. And now we will move on to the point of view of policy. Before doing that, I would like to encourage you to ask questions. You can ask any questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So our second keynote speaker is the Right Honourable Greg Clark. Greg is a Member of Parliament for Tunbridge Wells and Chair of the Science and Technology Committee. Greg was the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the last Parliament, and earlier ministerial posts included the Minister of State for University, Science and Cities, held between 2014 and 2015. Before being elected to Parliament in 2005, Greg worked for the Boston Consulting Group and held posts as the BBC's Head of Commercial Policy and Conservative Party's Director of Policy. Greg, it is great to have you here, and thank you for giving us your time, and over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Stefania. And first of all, an apology. The backdrop is deceptive. I'm not actually in Westminster, although it looks like a nice day in Westminster today. I'm in a church hall in my constituency because I've got to go, sadly, to a funeral of a local councillor, which means that I'm not going to be able to stay for the Q&A, which is very frustrating because there are lots of points that George raised that already would be good to enter into discussion on. But let me say from the outset that George was very modest in not drawing attention to his own contribution to policy making when he worked with Mariana Mazzucato. A lot of the work that George and Mariana did at UCL was very informative and in many ways was foundational to the work that we did on the industrial strategy, which, although the term industrial strategy may have been retired, I think the thinking is very much there, and that's what I wanted to talk about in my brief contribution this morning. So thinking about science and technology in particular, which is obviously something that unites all of the members on this call. And what are the frameworks in which the state and other participants are going to influence the development of practice and indeed policy on this? First of all, I suppose the good news is that for everyone that works in the world of science and technology, the years ahead, as you know, are some of the most exciting that we've ever experienced in this country in terms of scientific discovery and its applications. If you think of the transformations that are happening from everything from quantum to the analysis of big data, to discoveries in medicine, to the use of satellites, to name an inquiry that my select committee is currently engaged in, satellites to help us see and understand more from everything from agriculture to mobility. This is an extraordinary time. And in public policy terms, this has been recognized across party and even including the Treasury. And George is absolutely right that there's a big debate, or should be a big debate. I'm not sure that there is one, but there ought to be a big debate about the role of a finance ministry and an economics ministry. But the reason I say this was that when I worked on and launched the industrial strategy that George referred to, that was in 2017. I was able to persuade the Treasury of the importance of increasing substantially the public budget for research and development, the science budget as it's sometimes referred to in shorthand. And I was pretty pleased with what we achieved in increasing the science budget from £9 billion a year, as it was in 2016-17, to £12 billion a year, prospectively 5 years after that. From 9 billion to 12 billion, this was the biggest increase we'd ever seen in the UK science budget. But astonishingly, the budget that has just passed through the House of Commons, even though it's pushed out the target that the government had set for public sector investment in R&D, nevertheless commits to an increase not from 9 to 12 billion, but from 12 billion to 20 billion pounds a year by 2024-5, a relatively short space of time. So this is a time in thinking about public policy of great public interest and recognition of the role of science and technology. And it is now funded to a far more generous degree than it ever has been in the UK. And one of the things that is relevant is that the world in which there is a buoyant funding settlement, in which resources are rising predictably and in a sustained period over the years ahead, is a very different world when the cash is flat or increasing only in real terms. You can do more things. You can continue to fund the excellence that we have, whilst looking for other things to be able to deploy using this rising tide of public funding. So that is a very important development in the landscape of public policy towards science and technology. And I think it will be very influential during in the political discussions during the years ahead. And as I say, this is totally consensual. That's of all the heated debates that we have in Parliament, there is, I think, a widespread recognition that this is the right course to take, and that in trying to answer what George quite rightly pointed out is this big challenge of how we increase productivity. There's probably not a single answer, almost certainly not a single answer, but being more research intensive and applying the results of that research more widely and consistently in our economy is almost certainly one part of the answer. And this increasing public focus on science and technology, I think will, if it's done well, help with that. And that's one of the things that future leaders should guide us to make sure it is done in the right way and is not wasted. It's also, I think, obvious to reflect on the experience of the pandemic of COVID, where I don't think there's a person in the country, and not many in the world, apart from perhaps a few anti-vaxxers, that don't recognize the extraordinary, literally life-saving contribution that science can make, and can make at extraordinary pace. But it's also, I think, understood in policy and political circles that some aspects of that pace, in other words, the rapid development and deployment of vaccines, was itself a reflection of years of sustained research. And it wouldn't have been possible to have gripped the spread of COVID as we've been able to through the vaccines, had it not been for years of patient research excellence and application in this country and others around the world. So these, again, are very important messages. And one of the things that one finds in politics is that what the public see and understand to be important does filter into policy decisions. And I'm absolutely certain that the commitment to get to the 22 billion of public investment by 2024-5 and 22 billion within 2 years after that was very much sustained by the recognition of what's happened during COVID. So just a few kind of pointers from my perspective, a very subjective take on what to look forward to in the public policy agenda. And the first is this, that exactly as George was saying, the state, government of one emanation or another is, I think, going to be increasingly active in the science and technology space. If we take some examples. Obviously, if we take the most recent example of the development and deployment of vaccines, it was public as well as private and charitable funding that led to the development of vaccines, whether it was in the University of Oxford, an independent institution, but in receipt of public funds, and in particular the collaboration between researchers, between industrial companies, between governments and regulators is seen correctly, in my view, as an optimal way to proceed, and that we wouldn't have got where we got to, would have been possible if this had been left entirely to the commercial sector to fund and to manage. Nor do I think that if a kind of vaccine development program were run entirely from Whitehall, as it were, from the government, that would be successful either. I think the sense of collaboration across sectors is very much something that people draw from the vaccine program, and that will have reverberations in science policy and research policy in the years ahead. But it was reflecting a trend that had already been there. When the industrial strategy was launched in 2017, there was a brief kind of frisson of concern as to whether governments, and perhaps particularly conservative governments, really ought to be so engaged in, as it were, the real economy, the decisions of businesses and non-state institutions. The reputation of industrial policy, industrial strategy in the 1970s had left something of a bad taste. It wasn't notably successful. It tended to be associated with subsidies to failing industries and trying to prop up individual businesses that were failing, rather than something that was productivity enhancing and that was looking into the future. It seemed to be more about preserving the past and not terribly successfully. But that critique didn't last very long. And even though the words industrial strategy are not much used, I think you can see in the engagement that there now is between government and industry and also science, a very intense interest in our future when it comes to innovation and its applications. George mentioned the experience of offshore wind in attaining our net zero ambition. And that, again, is quite a good case study in some ways of the co-determination of policy between the private sector and the state. I was very proud to be the Minister of the Secretary of State that brought in the legal commitment to attain net zero in the UK by 2050. But the attainment of it very clearly involves research and development, and it involves the private sector. And as George says, the contracts for difference in which the early deployment of offshore wind proved very effective in bringing down the cost of offshore wind in this country to the point that it is now, in many cases, the cheapest form of energy generation, as well as one of the cleanest. You see this connection between the public sector, between government and the private sector when it comes to the development of electric vehicles, for example. Very important interactions between the regulatory requirements of a relatively new industry in terms of charging points, much public debate about the need to have a network of charging points. A lot of engagement in terms of the next generation of battery technology. In the industrial strategy, we founded the Faraday Institute, the Faraday Challenge, to make sure that we were able to be developing in this country the next generation of technologies, of battery technologies. We set up the Battery Industrialization Centre, which is located on the campus of Warwick University, to turn new discoveries in battery technology into industrial application. So there is a great deal of connection already, and I think will be increasingly, given this higher level of public funding, between governments, between Parliament and science. So in many cases, that is, I think, an acceleration of a recent trend, but it does play into some very important debates that have taken place over many years in the science community. Many people will be aware of the Haldane Principle, which states that or is interpreted as saying that the governments should provide the funding for scientific and humanities research, and then it should be up to the research community, the scientific community, to decide how it's spent. Now, that is true, I would say now, only up to a point. And that if the government is spending, during difficult fiscal times, an extra £10 billion a year on science and technology, it absolutely has an interest and will express its interest in what that is spent on. It will have priorities. George described them as missions, whether they are to get our country to attaining net zero emissions, whether it's finding answers to some of the challenges of the aging population, whether it's how we can drive up productivity and make use of discoveries and apply those discoveries in areas like the analysis of big data. The government will have a close interest in that, and there will be a co-determination of the agenda that comes from additional funds. I think most of these additional funds, I would say, will come for projects that the government has deemed to be societal challenges that need to be addressed, and attaining net zero is one of them. So for better or for worse, I think the scientific community, the research community more generally, is going to have an ever closer interaction with government. And so, if I could say perhaps rather provocatively, sometimes it's the case in calls like this, in discussions like this, that there's a great cry, there's a great concern that we should have more scientists in government and in Parliament to better understand science. And I agree with that. I think it helps to have that. But actually, it's very important, in my view, that people in science, and especially leaders in science, which is the common denominator of people on this call, should understand better how politics and policy works, because it affords big opportunities, and one way or another is going to be very determinative of a lot of the decisions that are made. A world in which research and science took place in places impervious to interaction with policymakers in Whitehall and Westminster, I think is long gone, and we're heading in the opposite direction to that. So the work of the foundation is absolutely timely in bringing that together. I'll just say make a few other observations before I'm afraid I have to leave the call and leave it to others to discuss. But one is not to think just of the involvement of the state as being central government. One of the big themes of the current administration and I think the opposition prospectively and Parliament generally is this big concern to improve the standing and prospects of the regions and the nations of the UK. The idea that we've been too centralised a country, that London and the South East have been too dominant as drivers of our prosperity, I think is now widely shared. And we formed over the last 10 years and before through the devolution of power to Scotland, Wales, and to a certain extent Northern Ireland, we have institutions now that are capable of, ambitious for, and have already some experience of participating in that, whether it's the mayors, such as we have in the West Midlands, Andy Street, in Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham in Teesside with Ben Houchin. We now have very strong leaders and more, I expect to see greater influence on the part of the regions and an agenda, whether it's called levelling up or whatever term is applied to it. This will be very prominent in the years ahead. And so connections between scientists, researchers, and institutions and local leaders will again be very important. Now, already universities, for example, are often the most important economic as well as cultural and scientific actors in their regions. And on the boards of the local enterprise partnerships that were set up after 2010, my recollection was that there wasn't a single one of them that didn't have a university vice-chancellor represented there, not because they were mandated to be there, but because the reflection of local economic leadership included universities. So don't forget that regional aspect as well. And finally, before I close, just a word about international collaboration. George said that if he had the answer to the productivity puzzle, then he'd be receiving the Nobel Prize this month for that breakthrough. But there's something about Nobel Prizes, whether it goes to George or not. I've had the privilege as the UK Science Minister of being at the Nobel Prize ceremony. And what is striking is how most of the prizes that are given tend not to be to single individuals who have come up with a brilliant personal insight that has changed the world, but they tend to be awarded to teams, and those teams tend to be international. And the collaboration between institutions, I think, is now recognized as increasingly important. But we are, I think, in a state of flux about what is the right arrangement of those institutions. Now, some of you will know that given the contested discussions on Brexit that have taken place in recent years, I have perhaps a position of notoriety as a Remainer. I lost the whip. I was thrown out of my party for opposing leaving the European Union without a deal. And in office in the Theresa May administration, I worked very closely to have a very close relationship with the European Union. So I declare my interest there. But even from that position, as historically a strong Remainer, I found when I was, take an example, at the COP in Glasgow a couple of weeks ago, and as someone that's been a veteran of previous COPs, I've never seen the European Union as uninfluential in the discussions as it was in Glasgow. Very interesting that the initiative and the discussions seem to be with other networks of nations. And as we all saw in the final moments, an agreement between China and India. So I do think that there is unfinished business for the science community as well as the government to discover what will be the future networks of international collaboration. And they may not be the ones that we have traditionally relied on in previous years. This may be a temporary phenomenon when it comes to the European Union. We know that there's something of a transition going on in Germany from Chancellor Merkel. there are political challenges in France with the next year's election. So I don't want to say that that will be a permanent state of affairs, but I think an appetite and some agility in terms of networks of international collaboration will be very important. In Parliament, during all this time, Parliament is interested in all of these issues. I have the great privilege of chairing what I think is the most exciting committee in Parliament, certainly has proved to be over the last couple of years, the Science and Technology Committee, which is where all of these things come together, whether it's understanding how new technologies can make a transformative difference, to understanding questions of funding and public policy. So we will do that. We try to, if it doesn't sound patronizing, to educate the rest of Parliament. We have 11 members of our committee. There are 650 MPs. Part of our role is by taking evidence from experts to inform the rest of the House of Commons. But we do so, as many of you know, in public, and we get a lot of interest in our sessions, which I think, going back to where I started, shows that we are at a period in which the prominence of science and technology, I think, is set to continue to prosper during the years ahead. I will leave it at that and wish you good discussions for not just this session, but the rest of your deliberations over the next couple of days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. What an interesting talk, and you packed a lot of information in your speech. And thank you for your time. We know that you will have to leave soon, so it's a shame you will not be available to join the panel session, which is about to start now, and which will run until around 11 o'clock. Now, coming to the panel session, we have two of this year's Foundation Future Leaders joining our first speaker, Dr. George Dibb. We'll start the panel session by gathering some points of view from each of the two future leaders. And to start with, I'm delighted to introduce you to Dr. Sarah Roberts. Sarah is a chemistry industrial partnership manager at the University of Bristol. Her role is to build and develop external collaborations with partners across all sectors. Before joining the University of Bristol, Sarah spent 10 years in industry, working at the interface of technology and marketing, developing and delivering innovation to market. She started at Unilever and then progressed through a large food business, and she finished in the retail giant Yum International, working for the KFC brand. So Sarah, over to you. You are going to deliver a 5 minutes address to the participants. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Stefania, for the introduction. Just to also note that I am a scientist. I was a chemist a long time ago. I did a PhD in chemistry many years ago, and I do find in my current role that I'm dredging back to some of that information. First of all, let me say great thanks to George and to Greg for the speeches this morning. My thoughts on what was presented really come down to, I think, to one sentence. When we're thinking about what we want to achieve, are we really valuing the right things? Are we putting the right incentives in place? Are we incentivizing the right type of relationships? And I think in terms of what George was speaking about, thinking about where technology comes from, that sort of balance from the push to the pull, I think we need a balance of how we intervene across that entire space. I think we talked about how perhaps in the past, the government had intervened more at the market end and has perhaps moved towards the sort of innovation end. And I think what we need to remember, though, is that every way that we invest in research and technology development, we need to remember the foundation of fundamental research that's needed for new ideas to come, as well as balancing interventions and support for projects to move through and to come through into market demand. One role I think the state has to play, which I think both speakers referred to, is in terms of shaping those markets. And one role the government can play hugely in that is procurement, in driving demand for new technologies. One thing the government can do is they can do things the market won't do. The market will respond in certain ways in response to sort of perceived consumer need to stay in sort of safe positions. And the government has the power to create new markets, to create new space, create new demand, to pull technology through, to deliver against the kind of challenges we face. And key things in this space as well are, I think, about building relationships. People talked about collaboration. Greg referred to international collaboration. George referred to collaboration. I think one of the things we need to look at in terms of, you know, we all value the new funding that's coming from government and the time that will come, but are we ensuring that as we offer research funding to institutions like universities, that we're encouraging them to be as collaborative as possible and not just compete against each other, but to actually come together to solve these enormous problems, which, as we've said, in terms of Nobel Prizes, are very rarely one person. These will require huge teams of people, not just across universities, but across disciplines as well, and how we ensuring and building those relationships grow. I think the last thing as well is about productivity and inequality. It's something I feel very strongly about, and I think it's something that if we're not able to see delivery of the rewards of us moving forward and solving these problems across all of society, which is one of the things productivity talks about. This is not just wages at the top end of the spectrum. This is wages for the average working man at the bottom. And in, you know, some of the regions, I grew up in Newcastle. It's a very struggling region at times, and if we're not able to share the rewards in a equal way, to create a environment, an economic system that works to reward all people across all levels, that values skills in the same way as we perhaps have valued in the past academic achievement, then I do worry that we won't see the growth that we need to see. We won't see regional development. We won't see some of these big problems being solved, because how are we incentivizing people who perhaps have different social backgrounds, who perhaps have different needs? How are we incentivizing them to join us in the challenges that we need to tackle as a society, as well as with the technology that we want them to take up and the changes we want to make? I think that's all I'd like to say for now. So I hand back to Stefania.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. This was a very insightful answer to the keynote presentations. And now let me introduce the second future leader, Dr. Alex Poulton. Alex is a research scientist at Heriot University, and he is the Deputy Director of the Lyell Center for Earth and Marine Sciences. This is an institute which brings together researchers working on earth and environmental sciences. Alex's research focuses on how the biology of the ocean regulates the climate and the sustainability of fisheries. Alex is also interested in the interaction between policy and research, especially around emergent research topics such as sea deep mining and ocean carbon dioxide removal. So over to you, Alex, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Stefanie. Thanks to George and to Greg also. I found the focus on science and technology really encouraging from both of their talks, and certainly the recognition of the need for investment to address the issues and also direct the market and the innovations needed. So I guess my perspective is about personal choice and leadership. The scale of the issues are staggering to consider at an individual level, but that is also the level where I believe we need to start to build a groundswell for change. And also, where do we look for leadership towards that? As an earth scientist concerned with the climate crisis, is the scientific, economic, and political understanding that I'm interested in. What can I do? What should I do as a scientist, as a parent, as an educator, and as a future leader in science and technology, and also being part of the problem? Who can I help to inform me on these decisions I should make? How can I apply my research to assist in understanding the problem or the search for a solution? Is it more important to educate the next generation as to how the planet works? Is increasing climate and carbon literacy awareness important? Will it be successful? There's certainly a greater appreciation of the climate crisis in the wider population. The level of climate change denial or misunderstanding have declined with time, but is there the same level of understanding as what is needed in our day-to-day lives? What choices do we need to make? So I believe there's a need for leadership on multiple levels, teachers at schools to those in government, as well as cultural leadership. Wicked challenges because of the growth of global population and a global economy really need wicked solutions. We need to understand just how hard these solutions could potentially be on our daily lives. So central planning and the market have a role in all of this, but there's lots of caveats and roundabouts in both of these. For example, a reliance and the need for a short-term focus and the potential for rebound effects. So these are failures in our thinking, policy making, or market structure. Actually, failures play the game of consequences to actually think through what choices we make and what actually negative potential impacts these could have. There's numerous potential negative consequences that need to be thought through with net zero. Is there any point solving today's problems only to create issues for future generations? So thank you very much for letting me sit on the panel. I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Alex, for your speech. Can I now ask all panel speakers to please turn on their videos so we can see them? Okay, thank you very much. So we have about 25 minutes to answer some of the questions which have been coming. I'll try also to group them to try to answer everything. The first question is for George. And at the start of your talk, you framed the problems of an aging population, decarbonization, net zero as external to our economy. The recent Dasgupta review of the economics of biodiversity stated that the solution starts with accepting that our economies are embedded within nature, not external to it. Do you think there would be a positive shift in policy if we recognize that climate, all the members of society are also embedded into our economy and not external to it?
Yeah, shall I give that one a go? Can probably talk about that for the next half an hour, but we'll try not to. I think that's a great question, and I was really pleased to see that one get the most thumbs up, that other people thought that was interesting too. So first of all, I would absolutely agree with the kind of foundational bit of the Dasgupta review that actually it's a total failure of economics as a discipline to see itself as separate from the world in which we exist and not a fundamental part of it. That we can only understand how to reorient our economy to be more sustainable and fair and just if we understand how it interacts with the world around us. And I guess my framing kind of did an injustice towards that. But my main thought is that the question of how you then transform that into something which is institutional and governed by policymakers is a real challenge. Because if you accept that the economy is everything, then how do you govern everything and how can you make meaningful policy decisions? I think if one thing that mission-oriented innovation tries to do is to try to push to the same level of cost and efficiency wider objectives which we want the economy to achieve, and to raise those up the political agenda to the highest possible level. And I think that to some extent raising climate change and protection of our natural environment to that same level is absolutely critical. I think you can see some of the political challenges around that, though, if you look at things like the Treasury's net zero review and the way in which our policy making tends to be quite siloed across different topics, in that actually how policy then interacts with those challenges can be quite fraught. And it really goes to the point that I think both Sarah and Alex and Greg made, which is that you're then thinking about what are individuals and perhaps institutions' different remits and what are their objectives and incentives to act in different ways. So part of my critique of the Treasury is that it's set up to worry about debt. And if you create an incredibly powerful department and say your number one objective is to worry about debt, they're going to do that and they're going to do it really well, but they might do it at the cost of other objectives. And you end up with these somewhat counterintuitive and cyclical problems. So I think the challenge of adopting that kind of recommendation for the Dasgupta review is absolutely critical, but making it real for people and institutions is the challenge.
Thank you for your answer, George. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on George's answer, or we should move to the next few questions? So for the panel, the government has published in 2021 a series of strategic documents focused on innovation, including the innovation strategy, the life sciences visions, and so on. Given the considerations analyzed so far in this session, do you reckon that these documents and the strategies laid out in them are fit for purpose? And second, what should Parliament focus on in the next 6 months to properly scrutinize them?
Would you like me to start?
Yes.
So, do I think they're fit for purpose? I think there's lots of really good work that's gone into that. I think the innovation strategy is a great bit of work. And I know it had lots of interaction from, again, stakeholders across universities and civil society and research institutions. People who are probably in attendance maybe played some part in that. I think it is fit for purpose. I think the innovation strategy is so broad, it's not clear who it speaks to. Yeah, it very explicitly in its introduction, it talks about its aim is to talk to the business community. And as Sarah already said, rightly recognises that a huge amount of innovation happens in businesses. But then it goes to a level of kind of abstraction of talking about quantum computing and fundamental scientific challenges, which I think is absolutely right, but doesn't necessarily speak to that audience's concerns. So I think it is a little muddled. I think it would benefit from greater structure because there's so much good work in there about things like standards and regulation, which just require a bit of kind of structure around it. I guess my main critique of that is that I'm a bit frustrated that the innovation strategy even exists, because we did have a perfectly sufficient industrial strategy which didn't actually need to be scrapped in the first place. And I guess my skepticism as well would be that in March, when the industrial strategy was scrapped and replaced with the plan for growth, that was a transfer of responsibility away from Bayes, where the industrial strategy team was scrapped and moved to the Treasury. And I think the Treasury being responsible for industrial strategy raised quite a lot of eyebrows, because that is not the most, historically has not been the most friendly department to those kind of policies for all the reasons we've talked about. So I think Parliament should certainly focus on that and how the Treasury is actually going to make that a reality. It's been quite quiet about the plan for growth recently from politicians. I think it got maybe one mention in the spending review by Rishi Sunak, which is interesting. And the Treasury Select Committee have recently been looking at that topic. So I think their report, that should be really interesting when that comes out. I'm interested to know from Alex and Sarah's perspective as well about how they see the innovation strategy, because I mean, I certainly have one perspective, but I'm sure it's different for others too.
I'm happy to add some thoughts, George. Thank you for your comments. I mean, I think I agree with you that, we had a very clear industrial strategy, and then we've replaced it with something. And I agree with you, it has lots of value and it has lots of good thinking. I think for me, it's that question of short-termism versus long-termism. If you really want to tackle some of these really big challenges, you've really got to put the long-term thinking in. And this is where I think the challenge of politics and the need to sort of be seen to do something to change it, to change the wording, to market it slightly differently, to rebrand it, can become a real challenge and a real distraction from what's really going on. But putting that to one side, I think like George, there's a lot of value in it. I think I agree. I come from a marketing background, and one of the challenges I see in lots of these documents is, who are you talking to? Should you have one document trying to speak to everyone? Does that muddle the waters, as George has already referred to? And perhaps having a communication which is for the different audiences would be more valuable, or ensuring that the message is clear on all the levels that it speaks to, and how it broaches that whole range from, as we talked about, fundamental research through to things that are much more kind of happening now. And that's again speaking to whether you're thinking short term or long term. I think sometimes the only other thing I would perhaps comment on and bring up that I did think was interesting and valuable was the people and culture kind of strategy, and recognizing that the skills base and the drive there. And I think that speaks to my comments earlier, that a lot of this is going to be about relationships and about collaboration and about building understanding, which is one of the things the foundation does. And I've been very grateful to be part of the leadership scheme between government, academics and industry, and breaking down that siloed thinking and bringing those people together. And I think there's some great thinking in that. Again, I would say, are the incentives right? Are we really going to enable people to move between those kind of different types of areas to really encourage that thinking? Because I think, and I don't know enough about economics to answer the question about whether it should sit in the Treasury or BEIS, but I think fundamentally, if you've provided people are open and are moving around and are understanding the different areas, and we have a diversity of thought and thinking and experience, which again speaks to kind of ensuring equality in terms of expectations and possibilities for all people, then that is going to help us tackle these problems, because they are not going to be tackled by silos and individual thinking.
Okay, yeah, so I think innovation is certainly important and recognised, and it was quite interesting there. Some of the far-flung ideas and the quantum computing and things like that seem a little bit too far-flung and too future thinking. I think some kind of short-term thinking now in terms of leadership. So the Nudge report I actually read before it disappeared off the internet, and I found that actually encouraging, that there was research and they had thought about how to actually change the way that we think to adopt some of the things that we actually need to do. Innovations, the problems with the innovations and what has to be done is quite staggering in terms of actually, carbon capture and storage, for example. So I think actually the short term is actually changing some of the way we're thinking about these things.
Just if we could add one thing as well, sparked by what Sarah was saying, that tension between short term, long term. I think we have to, when you look at policy, you have to think two things. One, is what's in it actually good? But also two, is it sufficiently different that it really necessitated like a total refresh and a recommunication and a lack of all that goodwill that maybe you'd built up in the process? And, the industrial strategy had a huge amount of organizations contributing to it. Businesses really did buy into the industrial strategy. It had a scrutiny council that existed and was reporting, and yet it didn't even make it to its third birthday. So I think that, yes, we can always tweak and further improve policy, but there's also a point where that becomes detrimental to organizations and individuals' actual buy-in to believing that policy will exist and make a difference in the long term, which is so important. If you're actually trying to steer things and make things change, people have got to you have to change their expectations of future opportunities and future growth. So I really am worried that if we constantly tweak and constantly change on the short term, we don't capitalize any of the potential benefits of the policies that we're trying to put into place.
And I think I'd add to that then builds into how you then spend any and all extra money that's put in. If you're constantly then tweaking slightly the objective or the purpose for that, again, how do you build confidence in, say, researchers and business who need confidence to invest in these big changes, to de-risk going for big changes they're going to have to make, that the government is going to stick to one area? We talked about, I think George talked about, do you need to make choices or not? Again, I'm perhaps not qualified, but if you do make a choice, one thing I'd say, and I say this in marketing, is it doesn't have to be the right choice. It's often about how you then implement it. You could have two choices that are kind of equally valid and could both work. You go for one, you stick with it, and you invest and you make it happen. And you need, for some of these big things, perhaps we need that level of conviction and long-term commitment and kind of, as you say, not tweaking and changing on both budgets and policy to go, we're gonna do this, and we're gonna commit to it.
I think that's so important as well with science and innovation, because the potential for payback is often on a timescale much longer than the potential for political change. So if you just think about how long it takes one person to do a PhD followed by a postdoc, rather than like a whole research program to exist, it's on such a different timescale. So we now have the kind of weird existence of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Funds, which are managed by Innovate UK within UKRI. They were set up as part of the industrial strategy. They still exist. They have billions of pounds of funding, but they no longer have an accompanying industrial strategy which exists in Whitehall that prioritizes the challenges that you need to confront. So yeah, a little bit of better matching between the timescales of kind of like political and actual scientific change.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we have a few questions regarding to the funding mechanism, the Treasury. So you mentioned on several points that there is some scope for reforming the Treasury and breaking it up to address some of the issues related to short-termism and to potential obstructionism, etc. So the first question is, what are the key barriers to reforming and breaking up the Treasury? And the second question is, what mechanism for encouraging technology development through government direction would be your priorities, such as the risking fixed returns, insurance frameworks, and so on?
So on the first question around the Treasury, I think there are a few different bits. So like, I would support kind of breaking apart those different bits of them that constitute the Treasury, as it's done in other countries, largely other developed economies like Germany or the US, where they have a finance ministry and an economics ministry separately. I think given that the Treasury is so kind of central to the Whitehall machinery, that kind of like momentum is quite a barrier. Also just the political proximity and physical proximity in number 10 and 11 Downing Street between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister is a challenge. For history nerds, it's interesting to look back to the 1964 creation of the Department for Economic Affairs by Harold Wilson when he became Prime Minister. That was exactly for the same reason that we're talking about today. The government had a national plan for the economy, and they were very skeptical that the Treasury would be institutionally able to deliver it. So they created explicitly an economics ministry that would think about that long term, where is the economy growing and how's it changing? So there were kind of like big political power questions about how to make that happen. I think within the Treasury itself, there are also processes though that can be changed, which would still have positive benefits even without breaking it up, for example. So the main way in which the Treasury decides how it spends money is around cost benefit analysis. You add up all the costs and you add up all the benefits, and if one outweighs the other, then you get the thumbs up, kind of. That's a gross simplification, but that's that process exists within what's called the Green Book. And now there are loads of practical ways in which that presents barriers to actual policy adoption. So for example, it's impossible to evaluate more than one policy at the same time. So if you're thinking about electric cars, you can only evaluate the policy of installing new charging points or a new battery factory. You can't understand the whole program of policy interventions that are transformational in their nature from start to end. So you can't do cost benefit analysis on them. So you can only understand one part of the puzzle by itself rather than understanding them as an interlinked whole. And that is so key when I think, just going back to one of the things that I tried to talk about, which is it's not sufficiently to just think about growth, but to transform the economy to a different way of working, i.e. a low carbon way. So like that individual process could be changed and has been changed. The Treasury recently did a refresh of that because to look at how it was a barrier to levelling up or to regional inequality. So I think there are kind of specific things there that can be done. In terms of what would be my priorities, I think I'm sure people on the call are aware of ARIA, the Advanced Research and Inventions Agency, which is kind of like the UK DARPA. I think that's a really positive change in the UK landscape. I think I would really urge people not to see it as the only change to the UK innovation landscape and burden it with such great expectations. DARPA is a tiny part of US R&D expenditure, but can have transformational effects. So let's not pin too many of our hopes on it. I think my main priority would be making sure that we do think about that demand side rather than just a technology push side. I think the UK is already a world leader in blue sky, curiosity-driven research. We have some of the strongest universities and research departments in the world in the UK. It's about how can we tweak the demand side to make sure that we can create demand for those new technologies and pull them through. So as Sarah was saying, procurement is really critical. We saw that during the pandemic, the way in which the government gave a volume guarantee, i.e. it said, if you, AstraZeneca, make it and it works, we'll buy 1 million doses of it. Probably not 1 million, whatever the figure is, 100 million. That kind of security and de-risking provides an incredible protection for businesses and a space in which they know they're free to innovate because they will get their money back. If you are, that is surely beneficial, because if you're, imagine doing that for electric vehicles. If you create an electric vehicle which has this range and this efficiency, we will buy 10,000 of them for every police constabulary in the UK. You can imagine how that creates like an incentive for companies to invest in a space in which they know they will get a return on their investment. So there are other ways you could do that, like a price guarantee rather than a volume guarantee. So my priority would be thinking about that demand side. I think that's pretty critical as well to kind of energy transformation stuff too.
I would add, and I think it just builds on what George was saying, is that in that, you know, I hadn't realised the sort of restriction that in a cost benefit analysis you could only sort of look at one policy, and I think that's really worrying. So I think when we look at when we and scientists talk about sort of net zero, it's often in terms of systems, because it's not simply changing one thing. They're very interconnected systems, and then when you bring in the complexity of behavioural change you might need to have as well. So that does feel a bit worrying. And I think the other thing which you referred to also as well, George, was in terms of when you're doing a cost benefit analysis, and this is in the Disruptor review as well, how do you put values on less tangible things, or things that are sort of less sort of, you know, it's not like money in the bank or money not in the bank, it's the pollution, it's the societal gain, it's all these things. And I agree, I get George's point, you can't model everything, it becomes incredibly complicated, but are we bearing enough of those less traditional values in our analysis and in a systems way to take the kind of complex decisions that will be needed? Now, whether that means we have to split them up or not, I suspect it does, because I think you do need, it's like running a household, isn't it? You need the kind of day-to-day, I run my budget, I need to, you know, pay my bills and get the shopping in, versus long-term, I want to build an extension, I need to think about how I'm planning for that and what that's going to mean. And that's very different thinking, and it's hard to have those in the same place. They need connection, because obviously they're interconnected. They're obviously, you know, one depends on the other. If you don't stick to your budget and have any savings, you can't build the extension. But equally, you can't, if you're just thinking about meeting your debt and everything else, you're never going to think about what you might want to do in 10 years time. So I, you know, then it does sound like not really having understood that there's changes that could be made.
Yeah, I'll just add to what George and Sarah are saying, thinking about the cost benefit analysis, some of the choices that have no clear benefit, well, they have no clear profit effectively. For example, electric cars, yes, there's a profit there, there's a market, you can build a market for that, but things like carbon capture and storage, there is no market, because effectively it will cost companies to install, and so there has to be some incentive financially and maybe government to actually help with that movement, because those are just as important as actually decarbonizing the economy, is actually trying to carbon capture and store and to do it that way.
There's interesting things within that as well, and I can see we're getting close to time, so I won't go on too long about cost-benefit analysis. But like, there's a concept called discount rate, which is basically people would rather have £10 today than be promised £10 in 1 year in the future. So like, there's a way of like modeling that in thinking. The problem is that creates a bias for nowism rather than creating change which is actually going to protect the environment or nature or the climate in 50 years in the future. And full disclosure, because I'm not an economist, the way I think about that is that actually that's quite a deep ideological choice. Like, it's not purely a mathematical thing about you can model, if I gave you £8 in a week versus £10 today, which would you prefer? There's a choice around, are we making an economy which is better for us now at the expense of future generations? And I think that is ideological and political and should be contested and debated. but it's a hard question and something that we have to do that thinking about. So all of those choices and ways we understand the world and the economy that we live in kind of go through this modeling, which is somehow incorporated in the model, in kind of these frameworks of making policy. And as Sarah and Alex have said, like, we need to think about those in the round and in systemic ways, and in a way which capture non-financial benefits and make sure we think about the future too. But some of that is easier said than done, but it's definitely worth doing.
As you said, George, if we had the answers, we'd all have a Nobel Prize, and it would be great.
Thank you to the panel speakers. I'm conscious about the time we have come to the end of session 1, and I also want to thank the public for submitting these very interesting questions. So thanks again to speakers and panelists. Now we have a 30 minutes coffee break. The next session will start at 11:30, and its topic will be, is net zero by 2050 or earlier realizable? So thank you very much for the first session. I think it was extremely interesting, and we see each other in half an hour.
Thanks, pleasure to be here.
Thank you, bye.